Hey everyone, in this lesson Pliny wraps up his letter to Tacitus. So we'll just get started. Interim, meanwhile, we're on page 265, I should say, of Lafleur's Relax Latin Reader. Meanwhile, at Misenum, this is again one of these locative examples. So it's this old case that looks like the genitive here, but really is something else. It locates us. Ego et mater, and Lafleur makes the note here that Roman speakers, or Romans, Latin speakers, put the first person first before the third person. So it would be ego et tu et mater rather than my mother, you and I, as it would be in English. So meanwhile, at Misenum, my mother and I, but nothing to history. So he's going to say ... we're doing this, but it is nothing. So we need to kind of supply an est here, but it is nothing for history. It's not worthy of note. And nec and not, and you did not want voluisti. So remember that this is from volo, vele, and then the third principal part is volui. So then we add this sti for the second person singular. We haven't seen that much in our readings. Sometimes it's easy to forget that. And what would the second person plural be? Well, you just add an s on the end, but we don't need to get into that. Voluisti, you wanted, and you did not want, as we would say, to know aliud. So this is going to be our direct object. So it's the direct object of our complementary infinitive here, scire, which works closely with voluiste. You want a complementary infinitive. Want to know anything besides, quam, except, we might say, concerning his exit, his passing. So meanwhile, at Misenum, my mother and I, but that's nothing for history to know, and you did not want to know anything other than about the death of him. Finem ergo faciam. I will make, or I should make. This is fundamentally ambiguous whether we are talking about a future indicative, active first person singular, or subjunctive present, right? We can't distinguish between those two. Therefore, I will or I should make an end. Unum adiciam. And we have the same exact problem here. Is it future indicative or is it present subjunctive? Impossible to know. So I should add one more thing, or I will add one more thing. And you can see that, there is a difference between those two meanings, but it's not material in this context. So the fact that we can't morphologically disambiguate these two forms, that doesn't really hurt our ability to read and interpret this sentence. It's just an ambiguity that is not important. So I should add, or I will add, one more thing. That, and this is tricky of Pliny here, note that we get omnia me, quibus, no t there, quibus interfueram, quaeque statim, cum maxime veram memorantur, audieram persecutum. And then Lafleur helps us out of this bind by saying that we need to supply a form of essay here. I should add one thing is similar to saying, deco, I am saying. What we're doing is we're triggering an indirect statement. So we're going to have direct objects and everything. So persecutum, put out, published in a way, and then, so this is going to work with may, to see, which is going to be our accusative subject. So that I put forth all things. This is frustrating and very irregular, that we've got a direct object before a subject in indirect speech. Almost always we'll get subject, direct, object, infinitive. That's how indirect speech works. That's how we separate some accusatives from others. But it's clear from the context, and that's the only reason here that this omnia can kind of slip out. And note that we don't actually even get the infinitive until much later. So the importance of having subject precede direct object here is a little less. But I still think you should be frustrated by it. But I should add one more thing. That I put forth all those things which I was around for. So intersum, being I am around, and then this inter is going to take the quibus, the ablative. So this is really a qui, that is a neuter plural working with omnia, but because inter sum takes a ablative, we need to decline this as it functions in the relative clause, and that's what gives us quibus here. So all those things for which I was around, and those things which immediately I had heard, when truth, we might even break this up a little bit differently. Well, let me use different markers here. So, and those things which I had heard, when mostly, when at the maximally, we might say, true things are remembered. So this is present, passive, indicative, just memorare. So nothing special about this verb, but we have it next to these pluperfects here. So this is a pluperfect. This is a pluperfect. I'm sorry, this sentence has become such a mess. We'll clean it up when we go through the whole thing. Persecutum, going finally with me, I put forth all these things for which I was around and which I heard. I immediately, statim kind of works with persecutum here, I immediately wrote down since, or at that time, cum works with statim, at that time when true things are remembered mostly. So it's important that he made notes on this whole experience when it happened. He's not just recalling these things 20 years later, but we don't know if this is true. Maybe he's just trying to, beef up his methodology a little bit. So to redo from finum on, so therefore I will make an end, or I should make an end. I will, or I should, add one more thing, namely that I wrote all these things out which I was there for and which I had heard immediately when they are remembered, when true things are remembered most truthfully, we said, or the most. I think that did a pretty good job of translating, despite my best efforts to screw things up, as I always do. Tu potissima excerpes. So you may, excerpt is the word that we get in English from this. You may choose, you may select, pull out, almost literally, the things that are the potissima, the most valuable. So what conjugation, what tense, mood, all that is excerpes. So if we go to the dictionary, we'll see that excerpo, excerpere, is the verb. So we know we're talking third conjugation. So it can't be subjunctive present, because that would be excerp as. So it can't be you may or should or whatever like that. What is this es then? Because excerpis will be the present active. This is one of those features in the third and fourth conjugation which get an e. We're used to saying, we'd have things like amabo, I will love, or wode bo, I will see. But if we get to something like excerp, we don't have excerpabo or something like that. What we do to mark the future in the third and fourth conjugations is to add an e in certain cases, or in certain, not cases, persons. So excerpes, you will excerpt. If we want to do something like a fourth conjugation or an io, it would be audies, you will hear. But here we have excerpes, you will choose the most potissima, the most potent on the one hand, but also the most useful. So you will choose the most useful things. Aliud est. And we get all of these aliud, and we should always apply est with it. And what we have is aliud, 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 aliud. This is, as we had seen in an earlier lesson, anaphora, where you repeat the beginning of the same thing over and over. So what aliud in this way is hard to translate with one word throughout. Another thing. What we want to do with this first another thing is to say it is one thing, dot, dot, dot. But, is kind of the implied, it is another thing. That's what aliud does in Latin, and we can't do this in the same way in English. So aliud is basically becoming one thing, dot, 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 another. So it is one thing, for it is one thing, and a letter, and that's in the accusative. Another thing, a history. One thing to a friend. Another thing to all, and then we finally get the verb that makes it all make sense, to write. So note that we have aliud here. It's not alius, it's not masculine. It's neuter because it's agreeing ultimately with this infinitive, and infinitives are always neuter singular. They're like the gerunds in that sense. They're always neuter and singular. So to write a letter is one thing. To write a history is another. To write to a friend is one thing. To write to everyone is another. So what Pliny is saying here is, I've written this letter just for you. You're going to know what to do. You're the historian, but I just want to write my piece. Of course, as we're saying this, we know, or as he's saying this, we know that he's published it. He must have edited this for publication. He has the omnibus in mind, but he's kind of taking on this pretense that he's just writing to a friend that can apologize for anything. It kind of raises the stakes. If this is the kind of letter he writes to a friend, what sort of superlative chiasmus and all these other styles, anaphora, anakaleuthon, a syndeton, all these things that he uses for effect in his letter. If we imagine he's just doing that to a friend, what would he do to all? This is a way of capturing the benevolence of the audience in the kind of final moments of making this seem like a really talented writer. So you will choose the most useful things. That's what Lafleur glosses, but it's really related to potest, those which can, the most powerful things. But here, not powerful except for storytelling, so therefore useful kind of makes sense. So you will choose the most useful things. It's one thing to write a letter, it's another thing to write a history, and it's one thing to write a friend, another thing to write for everyone. Wale, be well, signing off. Yours truly, Pliny the Younger. Hey, we did it. We'll move on to the Vulgate in our next series of lectures. Well, not lectures, lessons, whatever these things are. We'll see you then.